Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 57 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning in verse 16, and exploring all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 9, ending in verse 21. We've got quite a bit to talk about today, folks, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, folks, so picking up in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Within this chapter, verses 16 to 25 essentially reminds the congregation of Israel to keep the commandments of the Lord their God and to do what is right in the Lord's sight. The commands and decrees also serve as a testimony to their history. When someone, particularly the descendants of the Israelites, do not understand why they are doing what they are doing and why they are following these stipulations and decrees, they are to be pointed back to the story of Exodus, the story of deliverance and slavery from Egypt, and be reminded that these commands and stipulations set them apart as a nation. Moving forward, within chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, this chapter gives the Israelites specific instructions on driving out and destroying the nations of the land. Now, what is very interesting about this chapter is it not only names the nations that they are going to conquer, but it states that these nations are larger and stronger than the Israelites. So it points out the frailty of the Israelites. But ultimately here it does note that the Lord will deliver these enemies into their hands. Now here it's very important that the Israelites destroy these enemies totally. They cannot show them any type of mercy. They can't intermarry, and they especially cannot serve their gods. If Israel fails to follow these commands, then the Lord's anger will be burning against them in a very quick manner and will ultimately destroy them. Verse 7 within chapter 7 is interesting because it reminds the Israelites that Israel was not chosen or was not loved because the Lord saw that they were a great nation, but rather because he was keeping an oath to them that he swore with their ancestors. Because ultimately, Israel wasn't this great nation. It was just this small group of people in comparison to the nations that were already there. Now, in the latter half of chapter 7, the congregation of Israel is reminded not to be afraid of the nations that are larger and stronger than them because the Lord, their God, has been with them, and they're supposed to remember what God did on their behalf in Egypt. The Lord also tells them that he's not going to eliminate their enemies all at once, but little by little. But there are some promises here because he says things like he will not rest until the survivors perish. In fact, he says that he will send hornets and whatnot to essentially track these people down and to kill them if they survive. So, blotting out the enemies because of their wickedness and because God is gifting this land to the Israelites is very important. And so there is this promise of deliverance and this hope. Moving forward to Deuteronomy chapter 8, Deuteronomy chapter 8 gives rationale for the commands. It states that the Lord seeks obedience because obedience to the Lord leads to life and flourishing. He states that he gives the commands in order that they may live, the Israelites may live and possess the land that the Lord promised their ancestors. Now, within this chapter, the Lord reminds them of how he has provided for them in their journeying through the wilderness for the past 40 years and how he made it to where, they were provided for in terms of food and drink and how their clothes didn't wear out and their feet didn't grow and they were completely satisfied. Now, the Lord also reminds them that they need to remember him as they enter into the land and they eat and are satisfied and increase in number. Because essentially here we see this warning that as we grow more comfortable, we become less dependent upon God. And oftentimes our lack of utter dependence upon the Lord shifts our attention away from him and shifts our attention to idols and false gods. So that wasn't only the case for Israel, it's the case for all people throughout the entirety of the history of humanity, and it's obviously very true of us here today as well. So when I read this, I read it also as a warning and reminder to us. Now here, chapter 8 ends with a warning. It says that Israel is to heed the commands of the Lord and to not worship false gods and false idols. If they do, they will surely be destroyed, just as God destroyed the other nations. In other words, disobedience leads to destruction. All right, pick it up at Deuteronomy chapter 9. The Israelites are still being addressed. They are on the east side of the Jordan, and once again, the Lord is addressing their fear as they are about to enter into the promised land, and this time specifically to stand up against the Anakites. And here the Lord reminds them that they're not inheriting this promised land because of their own righteousness, but rather because of the oath that he swore to their ancestors. In fact, he calls Israel a stiff-necked people. And so essentially he wants it to get through their head, hey, you're not getting this because you deserve this. You're getting this because I made a promise. And so the congregation is reminded how they provoked the wrath of God in the wilderness at Horeb, even when Moses went up to receive the Ten Commandments, to receive the tablets that were inscribed on by the finger of God. And they are reminded that Israel, in their stubbornness, quickly forgets God. Moses was only on the mountain for 40 days, and he returns to see that they had abandoned the ways of the Lord and had crafted for themselves an idol in the form of the golden calf. And ultimately how Moses fell down in repentance on behalf of the congregation of Israel and on behalf of Aaron, and fasted and sustained and abstained from food and drink for 40 days in order that the Lord would preserve Israel and Aaron. And then ultimately the golden calf was destroyed, put into the water and sent downriver, but also how the Israelites and those who participated in this false worship were forced to drink water containing the gold dust. And so really there is this cryptic reminder that, yeah, Israel, look, I know you say, hey, yeah, we're not going to be like those other countries. Yeah, we're going to follow God. We're going to follow God. We're going to follow God. But historically speaking, that isn't the case. Within your own history, you guys haven't followed God. Within your own history, your ancestors didn't completely follow God. You turned from God and pursued wicked ways, and the Lord has been gracious and merciful to you. And the only reason you are receiving this land is because he is fulfilling a promise that was made unto Abraham. So it's here with this idea of a life of obedience and a life of complete and utter worship unto the Lord, and how the Lord has been merciful that we leave off in our reading for tonight. I hope you will join me tomorrow as we take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 9, picking up in verse 22, and we're going to read all the way until Deuteronomy chapter 12, ending in verse 32. Well, folks, enjoy the rest of your day, and as always, God bless.